Thank you, Julian. Penn, could we have the lights down, please? It's wonderful to see so many of you here today and to see such enthusiasm for Gordion. What Frank Matero and I would like to do this evening is to give you an overview of the latest archaeological developments at Gordion, both in terms of fieldwork and in terms of site conservation, and also to highlight some of the objects that will be featured in our forthcoming exhibit, tentatively entitled The Golden Age of King Midas, that will open here at the Penn Museum next February 2016, where it will be on display for 10 months. So many of the objects that I show you tonight, you'll be able to see yourselves as of February of next year. The site of Gordion, as many of you now know, is located in central Turkey, about an hour's drive southwest of Ankara. And as Julian mentioned, Penn has had the good fortune to conduct fieldwork there since 1950, initially under Rodney Young, then under Mary Voigt, Ken Sams, and Keith DeVries. And during the last few years, I have been director in tandem with many other colleagues whose name I will mention tonight. And I would like to second Julian's statement about our thanks to Dr. Charles Williams. There's very little that we've done that isn't directly dependent upon the advice and support of Dr. Williams. So this is very much his lecture as much as it is ours. The site of Gordion is many things. It's a citadel mound measuring about 200 by 300 meters. It is also two residential districts that surround the citadel mound. So one residential district called the Lower Town, another one called the Outer Town. The entire area encompasses about 100 hectares, which would be about 250 acres. And I will have occasion to say something about each of these areas tonight. You see an aerial view of the mound here, the citadel mound of Gordion, which is about twice the size of the mound of Troy, where I've had the good fortune to conduct excavations over the last 25 years. And if we were to analyze the citadel mound of Gordion and separate it into its constituent settlements, you would end up with a color phase plan that looks like this, courtesy of Gareth Derbyshire, our Gordion archivist, and Gabriel Pizzorno. So what we try to do with these multi-period sites is to formulate these color phase plans that enable you to get a synoptic view of how much settlement there has been in a single citadel mound. And in the case of Gordion, as at Troy, we have 9 settlements, one built on top of the other, spanning a period of nearly 4,000 years. The mound, in fact, is divided into 2 parts. An eastern part, which will be the focus of what I say tonight, because this is where Rodney Young and the earlier archaeologists have devoted so much of their time, and a western mound, which is very imperfectly explored, with a street between the 2 areas. And you see that drawn as well on the color phase plan. Gordion was the capital of the Phrygian kingdom, or the Phrygian empire, as it were. And the time period with which I'll be dealing is primarily the early 1st millennium BC. So from the mid-10th century BC, the beginning of the early Phrygian period, until the conquest of Alexander the Great, just after the mid-4th century BC. So I'll be dealing roughly with 500 years of habitation. I'll be able to show you Gordion in a different way than you normally see it, courtesy of our drone and graduate students from Penn who take part in the Gordion project. You're seeing here Lucas Stevens. This is just last summer, who is flying a drone over the archaeological site and the surrounding area. So what we're doing is taking you up 100 meters in the air so that you can get an appreciation for Gordion and the area around it, including the settlement mound, which I've just shown you in color phase plan, the interior of the citadel, much of which was excavated by Rodney Young between 1950 and 1974. You'll see some of the surrounding burial mounds, which I'll also have occasion to mention, the house in which we live and work, the village which produces many of our laborers, our workmen, and the Phantom 2 Vision Plus quadcopter, which has enabled these kinds of images to be given to you. And we thank the Penn Digital Humanities Forum for giving us the equipment that allows us to do such exciting aerial photography. I only want to mention some of the principal monuments of the Citadel Mound, primarily to set up the subjects that Frank Matero will address in terms of conservation. But I do want to emphasize that early Phrygian, Middle Phrygian, late Phrygian Gordian was intended to be impressive. The Citadel Mound rises more than 10 meters above the surrounding area. It still contains the best preserved Iron Age city gate in all of Asia Minor. And by the Iron Age, I mean roughly the period between mid-10th century and the 7th century BC. So you see the surviving Iron Age citadel gate on the eastern side of the Citadel Mound here, Frank Matero here, and our reconstruction of what we think it looked like originally. This was a structure that was probably as high as 16 meters, and one of the strongest citadel gateways that we know of in Asia Minor, even stronger for that matter than what Troy had built in the late Bronze Age, citadel construction phase, which is one of the strongest citadels that we know of. Our focus has not been in the middle of the citadel during the last few years. That was the area where Rodney Young devoted the majority of his attention. We've been looking at the perimeter of the citadel and also at the surrounding areas, the residential districts in the lower town, so just to the south and north of the main Citadel Mound, and the outer town, directly to the west of the Citadel Mound. These are both residential districts, probably from the early Phrygian period to the late Phrygian period. And exploring these areas, we've used the technique of remote sensing called magnetic perspection, about which I've spoken many times in this room. Magnetic perspection is a remote sensing technique not unlike radar, but using a different kind of technology. With this machine, operated by my colleagues Stefan Giese and Christian Hubner from Freiburg, we measure magnetic anomalies, magnetic variations in the magnetic fields of buried objects. Whether they be walls, buildings, or streets, whether they be stone or mud brick, this will record their existence. Let me give you an example of what it will do. This is one of the burial mounds in the vicinity of Gordion. There are over 100 burial mounds in the vicinity of Gordion, from the mid-9th century to the mid-6th century BC, and only about a third of them have been excavated. For the ones that have not been excavated, there's a danger that they will be looted before we can get there. And it's always difficult with excavating a burial mound. We call them tumuli, just another word for burial mound. With these burial mounds, the ancients weren't stupid. They didn't put the burial chamber in the center of the burial mound, because then the looters would always know where to dig. They would put it slightly off axis, so that if you're going to find the burial chamber, you have to sink trenches here, 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 all around the perimeter, like a needle in the haystack, until you finally find the burial chamber. With magnetic perspection, we can identify the burial chamber immediately. So I would never have thought of digging here, but the magnetometer isolates where the burial chamber is, and it also shows me that there are no looters' tunnels leading to it, so that I know it wasn't robbed either in antiquity or in the modern period, and that it's intact for us to investigate. We've used this technique all around the Citadel Mound of Gordion, the lower town and the outer town, and what that's done is to give us the circuit of the outer fortifications of the citadel. So this is the main Citadel Mound of Gordion, which is fortified, and then in addition to that level of fortifications, we have an outer circuit here, and then yet another circuit going around the outer town. So that's how we've been able to determine that we're dealing with a settlement that's over 250 acres in size, over 100 hectares. And this is more than twice as large as we suspected the city actually was. So again, this is with the benefit of magnetic perspection, which literally takes the guesswork out of archaeology. And in this case, has given us a clearer idea of the city plan than we ever had before. This gives you an overview of the outer town right here. And one of the interesting things about these fortifications that we've just determined, the fortifications of the outer town and of the lower town, is that these fortification walls are fronted by a defensive ditch, 3.5 meters wide. So that's about 12 feet wide. These defensive ditches are not a surprise. Troy has a defensive ditch. There are defensive ditches at various sites in Anatolia, in Syria, in Palestine. but we've never found one before at Gordion. So we've been able to determine that the fortifications of Gordion during the early and middle Phrygian periods in particular, between the 9th and the 7th centuries BC, were much stronger, much more sophisticated than we had previously suspected. And last summer, we got some wonderful magnetic prospection results here on the western end of the outer town, which proves the existence there of a fort that we had no idea was in existence there. The fort measures about 75 by 45 meters. That's about 250 by 150 feet. And so it is just as large as the main forts that are attached to the outer citadel wall, the outer wall around the main citadel. This is one of those forts that was excavated by Rodney Young, a giant mud brick fort built on a 12-meter high platform. Clearly one of the more sophisticated mud brick forts of Iron Age Anatolia. This one is the same size. So we've been able to prove that the settlement of Gordion was protected by at least one fort here, another fort here, and then yet another fort up here, for which we have good magnetic prospection results of a mud brick structure, some sort of barracks building for the army. This, by the way, this mound here we call the small mound, Kuchukuyuk, which had been destroyed by the Persians in the mid-6th century BC. So in this fort we find bronze arrowheads that literally had been fired at the defenders of the city by the Persian attackers. So this is more or less the situation as we now reconstruct it. A fortified citadel, an outer fortification around the so-called lower town, and yet another fortification around the outer town. So 3 fortified areas, which is again a new development. Now, fortifications have been very much a component of our research plan during the last few years of excavation. And here we've been digging and investigating the area on the southern corner of the Citadel Mound, where you see the purple circle. This is the area before we began excavations. And this is also the area where the street that bisects the mound enters the lower town. So we were interested in seeing whether or not we could find traces of first the street, and second a gateway leading into the street, and some trace of fortifications in this area. So as we dug down here, we found an enormous glacis or terrace wall that supported fortifications around the western side of the citadel. This was a new discovery for us. We knew the eastern side of the citadel was fortified, but we weren't certain that the western side of it was fortified as well. But you can see the stones still in situ. This is up to this point, 2.5 meters. So 8.5 feet, and it's likely that we haven't reached the bottom yet. It will go down 4 or 5 meters high. So the original would have been about 4 or 5 meters high with a fortification wall on top of it, which was about 3 meters thick. So again, far more sophisticated fortifications, even on the western side of the Citadel Mound, than we had suspected. And last summer, we expanded the trench so that it now is about 25 by 15 meters. And you can see here the glacis or the terrace wall leading up to the fortifications that I showed you in the previous slide. You can also see how massive they are, extending here for 16 meters and then turning the corner and extending for another 7 meters. If you look at this image, you get a sense of it. Again, the glacis, the continuation of the glacis or terrace wall leading into the side of the trench. You see the so-called Midas Mound in the distance here. And what we also discovered is that after a major fire in 800 BC, these fortifications, which are 9th century fortifications, were made even stronger. So this will enable you to see it a little better. Here again is the glacis that we excavated, and the glacis continues here. And then after the fire in the 8th century BC, they deposited an enormous amount of rubble in front of this glacis and built out so that they had some colossal bastions. I put a little colored square on top of it. This is the back side, this is the front side. A bastion that's 8 meters wide. which is just enormous. Although, if you look at the middle Phrygian citadel gate on the east side of the citadel mound, it has the same enormous proportions as what we found on the southern side of the citadel mound. So this was far better protected than we had ever suspected before. And here, as you see, we found the left side, with the western side, of the gateway and the street leading into the citadel. So you can see the burnt timber here and the burnt mud brick. We found this just at the end of the summer. So we will expand the trench here next summer, and that should yield the entrance to the street, the full street, as well as the gateway that crosses the street, and give us a sense of how the citadel connects to the residential district of the lower town. What we also were able to determine is that these defenses were phenomenally polychromatic, vibrant colors. So you see some of the colored stones that we found collapsed in an earthquake collapse here, and it clearly was the same kind of coloristic effect that we see for the middle Phrygian citadel gate on the eastern side of the mound. So the whole citadel, the whole settlement, would have been literally ablaze with color, which you'll see in a number of other images that I showed you. Now the main citadel, and I just want to set this up for some comments on conservation that Frank will make. The main citadel on the eastern side can be divided into two districts. An elite district here with mansions or megarons with a forecourt and a main room. And then another district over here, the Terrace Building, which is the industrial quarter of the city. All of this is 9th century BC. We have some amazing discoveries from the elite quarter of the city, excavated by Rodney Young, which includes the earliest polychromatic pebble mosaic ever to have been found, the earliest one in the world, 9th century BC. You see it at the moment of discovery here with a hearth in the center, a watercolor of what we think it looked like originally, as if you had a series of geometrically decorated carpets, all laid at a slightly different angle, but presented as if covering the floor. And then here, one of the panels of the pebble mosaic, and we will have one of these panels as part of our exhibit on Gordion next year, February 2016. Now, the Terrace Building, as I say, the industrial quarter of Gordion, is one of the largest industrial quarters that we have intact from the Iron Age period, from the 9th century BC. And it was here where you see the red dot that we sunk a sondage, trying to see if we could find evidence for industrial activity in this area earlier than the 9th century. And we've got a lot of good evidence for what they were doing in the 9th century. They were making textiles for the entire settlement, and probably for the settlements even beyond Gordion, and they were producing the foodstuffs for the entire citadel. So in some of these rooms of the Terrace Building, we have between 500 and 600 loom weights for massive textile production, and an equally large number of dishes and pots for cooking. So we began this trench, which turned out to be much more ambitious than we thought it would be. As you see, we had to go through 4 meters of rubble fill. So that would be nearly 15 feet of rubble fill. And you see Olivia Hayden and Kate Morgan, and somewhere is Jane Gordon from Penn, who are digging under this. I actually brought in an engineer because I was a little worried that this entire mountain of rubble would collapse on them, but he said that it was safe. And fortunately it was. And as we went down through these 4 meters of rubble fill, we found at the bottom in 11th century BC layers evidence for the industrial activity for which we had been searching. So an oven, a kind of kiln dating to the 11th century BC, as well as spindle whorls. So they were engaged in weaving and cooking, the same kinds of industrial activities that we find at a later date in operation in the Terrace Building, 200 years earlier than we thought. So shortly after the citadel of Gordion is established on a monumental level. And textiles. I've mentioned textiles and how expansive the industry was at Gordion. Fortunately, we have some of these textiles that have been excavated. Now, this is extraordinary to have textiles dating as far back as the 9th century BC. You see, and unfortunately this is sort of dark because many of the textiles were burned in the fire to which I've referred of 800 BC. but one of the Penn graduate students in Mediterranean archaeology, Sam Holtzman, has done a tentative reconstruction of what these textiles would have looked like when they were in operation. These were probably tapestries that were hung in one of the tapestries with some sort of monumental textile decoration for the walls, hung in one of the Megarons, in this case the third Megaron, right next to that Megaron with the polychromatic Pebble mosaic. And these two date to the 9th century BC. We learn more about textiles from Midas, who was an actual king living in the second half of the 8th century BC. Midas was a man who reached out both east and west. Phrygia would be here in the center of Turkey. Midas married a Greek woman, daughter of the ruler of the Greek colony of Kyme on the western coast of Asia Minor, was the first foreign king to make a dedication to the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, which was a wood and ivory throne. So something that might have looked like this, and a part of that throne has been found. You see the ivory component of the throne. It's an ivory lion tamer. You can see a standing lion here with the paws, the head, and then the lion tamer's head here. This dates to the late 8th century BC. Almost certainly was part of the throne that Midas dedicated to Apollo at Delphi. And fortunately, the Delphi Archaeological Museum will be loaning this to us next year for the Gordion exhibit. So you'll be able to inspect it face to ivory, as it were. Midas also reached out to the east, scheming with city-states in what is now southeastern Turkey against the Assyrians, who were, of course, trying to expand their empire as the 8th century progressed. It was during the reign of Midas that the Iliad was written down for the first time. And if you look at the descriptions of Phrygia in the Iliad, as I've indicated here from the third book of the Iliad, they describe a very wealthy kingdom, which indeed Gordion was during the reign of Midas. And this describes the strength of the Phrygian warriors, some of whom we have depicted in ivories from Gordion. And some fragments of the Iliad we have in our own collection at the Penn Museum. So these two will be exhibited in the show that we're doing next February. Now, our best evidence for Midas is in the first monumental project in which he was engaged, a tomb seemingly for his father Gordius, what would be the largest burial mound in all of Anatolia, all of Turkey, for over 200 years. 53 meters high, that's 170 feet high. You see it here in the red rectangle. Here is the Citadel Mound, and you see the other monumental burial mounds that surround it, but none as monumental as what you have in Tumulus MM, which Rodney Young christened MM because he thought it was the tomb of Midas, and so therefore MM for Midas Mound. We can fix the date of this to 740 BC based on the wood that has been excavated, dendrochronological analysis of the wood. The tomb then would have been set up probably over a period of several months, conceivably 5 months, by thousands of workmen, first setting up the floor of pine and cedar, then the walls of pine, and then an outer casing of juniper. And there was no door or window because there was never any suspicion that anyone would enter this tomb again. So before the roof went on, before this moment, the king's body would have been lowered into the tomb, and then the funerary gifts that were intended to accompany him into the afterlife would have been situated there, and then the mound would have been closed. But this couldn't have been done overnight. So you've just watched the tomb built, originally occupying a period of months, now occupying 30 seconds. And you see here the tomb as it would look to you today if you were to go to Tumulus MM. It still stands as the oldest standing wooden structure in the world, 740 BC, and excavated by Rodney Young in 1957. Inside the tomb was found the body, presumably of Midas' father, a man in his 60s, and covering him was a shroud that had been coated in goethite, an inorganic pigment that would have looked golden in the sun. And there's some evidence from other pieces of cloth that we have from Gordion that they too were coated with goethite. So you can imagine for the elite of Gordion, these gold lame gowns that they would have worn, just like the Oscars, as they walked through the streets of the city. So when we try to determine what is the origin of the golden touch, we were always stymied by that because there's very little gold that we find at Gordion. But if the story of the golden touch relates to these neo-lame gowns that they were wearing, or proto-lame gowns that they were wearing, the story takes on new meaning. And again, it's one of our more recent discoveries in the wake of new scientific analysis of the textiles. This gives you a reconstruction of the head of the man buried in Tumulus MM based on the dimensions of the skull. At the time the artist did this, he thought it was Midas, and he was depicting a man who, in his mind, he thought had just died from drinking bull's blood, which is what the Roman historian Strabo says, that Midas died after an invasion by the Cimmerians, a marauding group from South Russia, and drinking bull's blood, he went off into the afterlife. And when I was giving this talk once, a man from Argentina said, I have drunk bull's blood, and it's an aphrodisiac. But nevertheless, when the skull was reconstructed, it was with the sense that the man was eyeing a glass of bull's blood on his desk. So he was anxious. I wanted to close my section of this talk by highlighting the distinguished visitors who provide us with advice and support in the course of the summer, and by mentioning our interaction with the local community in new educational programs. So we benefited from the visits of Charles Williams, Julian Siggers, and Amanda Mitchell-Boyask during the summer. You see them here examining some of the material from a cremation burial from the 7th century BC, and we're fortunate in having them as regular visitors every summer. And you see here a new outreach effort pioneered by Gordion Assistant Director Aisha Saltzman, which is focused on the youth of the area. So in this program, Aisha and Halil Demirdalan, the Deputy Director of the Ankara Museum, together with Gareth Derbyshire, Naomi Miller, and others, educate the children about cultural heritage, the need to protect it, who the Phrygians were, why Gordion is important, and why it needs to be protected. These are all stakeholders in the region, but we need to reach them as children so that they learn respect for cultural heritage before something else, before intolerance gets in the way. So it's our investment in the future. And finally, then, I want to thank our donors, which include, first and foremost, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the museum in Ankara, as well as the Penn Museum, Dr. Williams, the Kathleen Seltz Foundation, and all of the others that you see here positioned above our new pottery depot, which enables us to do some of the pioneering research about which I spoke tonight. So with that, I will turn the floor over to my colleague, Frank Matero, who will explain how we're going about protecting all of these discoveries, which I've just indicated to you. This image of Midas Mound at sunrise, which is intended to look religious and to show the power of the Phrygian community and the Phrygian kingdom, which still overshadows much of what we do.
All right, everyone hear me? Good. Well, Brian has set the stage beautifully for what I knew I would be talking to you about, which is what happens after roughly 60 years, 65 years of excavation. I'm sure everyone in this room has visited many archaeological sites. I wonder how many of you have considered what those sites might have looked like when they were excavated, if not certainly before, and how they have changed since their excavation. It is a question that it is no exaggeration to say keeps me up at night.
Frank, how do I?
Oh, Control L. So, and I also should say, Brian has presented the site of Gordion as a multi-scalar site, and that's absolutely correct, particularly in terms of conservation. what I'm going to talk tonight primarily about is site conservation. But understand, and we probably need another lecture on this, there's been a great deal of work done on the finds, particularly, and other aspects of the site that go well beyond the architecture and the setting itself. Okay, good. All right. I certainly don't need to preface the statement on this image if you've been reading the news the last year. Heritage and conservation, they go together. And we know from recent events in the Middle East and elsewhere that heritage and sites become places that speak to cultural identity and who gets to own the past and who decides what that past should look like. Of course, the bombing on Buddha is a well-known case by now, but something even closer here in Philadelphia, the great debate over the President's house and how, in fact, the archaeological remains were proof positive of some fairly interesting facts that came to light about Washington and and slave ownership in Philadelphia. Archaeological sites represent actually more than 50% of the cultural sites identified on the World Heritage List. So of the 1,007 sites that have been identified based on cultural aspects, more than 50% are archaeological sites. Archaeological sites have always been at the forefront of tourism, of visitation since Herodotus. And so they are not sites that we are, they are certainly sites we are familiar with. But what has been painfully and increasingly clear is that they are at far greater risk than many other sites, so-called living sites today. Recent events at Pompeii, as you know, the collapses that have been occurring. I mean, this is due, really honestly, to poor management, lack of funds for maintenance. These can be avoided if proper steps can be taken. Perhaps a bit more daunting, climate change, rising sea level. This is an infrared photograph of sites in Iceland that will be inundated in the next 50 years. Other kinds of man-made disasters, potential disasters, development, uncontrolled development, as you see on the left, all too painfully. And of course, an activity that is, goes hand in hand with archaeological sites, the idea of tourism and visitation. Again, often touted as an economic benefit, but it also has its problems. So what I want you to continue to consider tonight, as we take a brief look at some sites around the world, I am going to preface the Gordion case with some other examples. I want you to think about this if you haven't already. First of all, sites are made. They are not discovered. They're not found. What you see is often a hopefully conscious manipulation of the excavation process as well as the conservation process. They are actually very often thought of as equals and opposites. Not here at the museum, I should say. So sites are made, they're not discovered. And the question I would put you, the 4 questions: how should we experience archaeological sites? Do we do it through our senses only? Do we read? Do we take the language of the museum into the site? Do we fill the site with signs, with waysides? Or do we rely on whatever we can grasp of the architecture of the place? How does conservation shape what we see, what we feel, and what we know? There are 3 different ways of informing ourselves. Thirdly, how can conservation preserve the archaeological record? This is a much more subtle but serious consideration. Sites are exposed, we see the gross features, but what about the fine-grained information that is left behind? How does that inform what future researchers will have access to? And then, fourthly, how can display promote an effective and active dialogue between the past and the present? How can designers, how can architects, how can landscape architects see, you know, and you feel. So I like to think of this problem as really one where humanistic and emotional concerns are pitted against the scientific and the rational. In this Capriccio by Claude Lorraine, a good summation of what the concerns were of a visitor in the 17th century to a classical site like Rome. The visitor contemplated nature, contemplated the end of all things, took solace in the fact that this was an eventuality that could be understood and in the mind's eye completed. On the right, a more scientific, a more rational approach, very well demonstrated beginning in the earliest years of the 18th century at Pompeii with the scientific excavations. Archaeology, scientific pursuit of archaeology, plus tourism means that those sites have to be interpreted for a visiting public. This is not a new concern, and in fact, it's quite interesting. When you look at sites around the world, many sites experienced site interpretation for a visiting public beginning at the turn of the 20th century. Knossos, Mesa Verde, there are many in Egypt, all around the same time, this interest in interpreting the sites for a visiting public in conjunction with or after excavation. You see on the right the palace at Knossos. But we have some biases that we have inherited through literature, through art. This idea that our archaeological sites need to represent the permanent, the monumental. But how do you take that notion and apply it to a site like Çatalhöyük, which is many, many, many occupation layers, made in earth with extremely fragile information on the surfaces? It is not a ruined abbey in the north of England. It's a very different kind of site that perhaps requires a different kind of presentation. So let me just quickly go through the options we have to set you up for Gordion. So we can certainly take a position of preservation. We can take a site and put a shelter over it and do nothing more than that. That's a very external attitude. It's one that has very little impact on the actual physical fabric. Here in Peru at one of the Huaca sites with its fantastic painting. Or on the right, a site here in North America where the site was excavated, it was reburied, and the interpretation was done with colored cords. Minimal, perhaps not very satisfying, but terrific in terms of archaeological record preservation. How do we compensate or reintegrate visually, structurally? Here on the left at Mesa Verde, very little was done. That was a conscious decision because of the high state of preservation in the alcove setting, and so buildings were not reconstructed, nor were they even completed. So what you see is predominantly original. Whereas what's happening now with the Acropolis in Athens, where even the wall lacunae, even the small losses in the wall of the building is being infilled with the same Pentelic marble into the original construction. A very interesting, progressive idea, but one that is not shared in terms of its approach universally. What about removal ex situ, where the finest bits are removed and taken off-site, like the paintings in Santorini in ancient Thera, or on the lower right to a museum in Paestum from temples on site. And then what about restoration? Whether it's anastylosis, where the actual original fabric is simply reassembled to give the form back to the architecture, or in the case in the lower right here in North America, where one feature in a much larger settlement has been reconstructed and the rest have been preserved in their fragmented state. So all these examples suggest a very different approach, which I think changes the way you feel, you think, and you see, hopefully in reversal. And then here in Philadelphia, one of the more novel approaches from the 70s, a very postmodern idea that you can't do any of the above. It's all a fiction. It's all a manipulation that is too subjective to the viewer. So let us simply acknowledge that and make a cartoon out of the site. Make a hyper site, a hyper visualized site here at Franklin Court, and then let's keep the archaeological information down below where we can look at it through viewing tubes. This is Bob Venturi's quite creative attempt to interpret a site for which we know very little visually, but have a lot of textual information. Okay, so that then brings us to Gordion. In fact, this year for me marks my 10 years at Gordion. The first half was contemplating what to do. And you'll see why in a minute. So this is the site, more or less, as I found it in 2005 when I arrived following one of my late former students who had taken the challenge on. You can see not much attention paid to site interpretation, looking more like the Maginot Line than an archaeological site. So you remember the pithy statement a few images back: sites are made, not found. For me, Gordion, the first feature one has to acknowledge is the fact that it is an artificial construction on a relatively flat landscape. The mound is the thing. Shakespeare said the play is the thing. I say at Gordion, the mound is the thing. The mound is probably the greatest artifact we need to pay attention to in terms of its visuals on the landscape. And it has been literally spoiled by the spoil heaps from all the soil taken out from the interior, with fingers stretching out. On the right, it is as much a hole now, a pit, as it is a mound. So one constructed an anthropogenic construction, an ancient one, the other more recent in terms of excavation. These are two realities that we have to confront. Early excavation, of course, revealed Gordion, hence the title of our talk today, but the archaeologists and the conservators are remaking what has been revealed. So here you see some early photos from the late 50s as the site is being excavated, and you see particularly the early Phrygian occupation period and the gate literally coming out of the ground. Prior to my arrival at the site, there had been limited preservation work done on the left. Some very interesting and rudimentary forms. You can't really see this too well, but it's how many Turks does it take to counterbalance the lifting of stones? They're all hanging off this fulcrum and lever. And on the right, my former student Mark Goodman and the Turkish workmen he had with him doing really a heroic job stabilizing the great gate that Brian spoke of, that will be the subject of this coming year's work as well. So here, two very interesting comparisons. You might think the image on the left is after, and the image on the right is before, but is in fact quite the opposite. This is what 50 years of weathering of an exposed site looks like. There's also a bit of reburial here, but by and large, 50 years of weathering can be quite detrimental to a site. Those first 5 years, it's a fairly paltry list to show you for 5 years, but it is where we arrived after considering many of the issues that, in fact, Brian handled. Who are the stakeholders? What are the primary components that we want to deal with? It's not enough just to have an excavation strategy. We need to also have a site conservation and management strategy as the excavation is going on. And I have to say, to Brian's credit, I've never worked on a site where a moratorium on excavation occurred for a period of time for the conservation to catch up. And that is to his credit alone. To develop a public program and public outreach, you heard about that in terms of Aisha Gressman-Salton's work and others, Naomi Miller and others. So this is, it would be unconscionable for a museum or any entity to consider an excavation conservation project at an archaeological site without these components in place today. And then, of course, the major issues, as you see below. We've already gone through some of these. So let me put this this idea on the ground for you in terms of what it looks like. So in the second 5 years of that 10-year period, which brings us up to the present, a series of phased work that is partly based on what's important, work that's partly based on integrity, how much survives, and work that's based, quite honestly, on emergency condition. And so we're actually, I'm happy to say, more or less in the third phase of this. So there was a lot of catch-up to do. Times had changed, methods had changed. Brian certainly showed you some things like the drones, like the drone. We certainly wanted to employ laser scanning, being a school of design, 3D. Nobody can think in 2D anymore. Everyone thinks in 3D. And so we did a scan of the gate, as you can see on the right, so that we could get a better sense of the volumetry of the structure, and also something you can see here, which is the bulge, which had developed since the excavation in the 1950s. And that is a great concern and will be the subject of our work this year. Low altitude aerial survey, first with weather balloons, now with a drone. This gave us the ability then to start to name everything, to label every wall, every surface, so we could get on with the work of recording our work. And I put this up just to remind me, to remind you, to tell you that what we talk about now in terms of actual physical conservation is intervention, management and planning and protection that is based on a clear and precise identification of values. There are all kinds of values: archaeological value, historical value, economic value, age value, social value. These very often in the past were simply implied and never described or pursued in ways that put them on the table for all the stakeholders to discuss and to debate. And so we are very honest about this now in terms of how value drives what we do. And I have no doubt that those values, or the order of those values, will change in the next decade, will change in the next 50 years. They'll probably still be on the table. They might be in a different order. So what that would look like then is something like this. How do we make decisions? Do we pick restoration, preservation, anastylosis? Do we bury, rebury? Do we shelter? How do we make those decisions? This is just one thought diagram for the Terrace Building, which I will show you. So let's take a look at just a few of the features in the interest of time. Well, I have to include the gate. It's really the most monumental, the most significant. It certainly was to the Phrygians, and they certainly put their effort in it. It was functional, it was defensive, but it was also awesome. The right word in a period when we overuse it, right? And so here you see the entrance, the early Phrygian gate. You just see a bit of the middle Phrygian gate here, of course, which was an enormous structure, long lost. Some of the condition of the stones, and then just some of our digital recording of what it takes now to do the work properly in terms of stone-by-stone condition survey. Just to show you I actually do physical work. I don't just use my eyes. And one of the innovative things that we've been doing is, again, this is the joy of being at a university and doing cross school work together, research together. Over in School of Design, there's been, of course, several years now of research and implementation of green roofs, sustainable design. And the idea of a green roof is very attractive for an archaeological site, because one of the things we don't have the ability to do here is to maintain it with a high maintenance cycle. And so the idea of a green roof is a naturalized capping. It's a naturalized way to protect the masonry from all the evils of rain, snow, and other natural problems. And so here was the earlier protective system, an honest approach. It certainly worked. A great concrete slab put on the top of the pylons. And through a series of steps researched by some of my students, you just see them here, going from what we started with to the use of synthetic materials, the kinds of things you see on houses getting today, various kinds of gravels, more kinds of geofabrics, and then ultimately a garden that's growing on the top that will keep the temperature buffered, will keep the water out, it will hold the water, it will evaporate it out, and grass that grows, which is the native grass thanks to Naomi Miller, will transpire that moisture as well. Here's what it looks like, nice and green in the late winter. You can see all the green poking through the snow. So this has been a very effective method, and we hope to use this on many other massive masonry sites. The terrace buildings, the largest complex of buildings on the site as we know it, dry laid, made with, as Brian said, multicolored stones taken from different quarries, experienced disastrous fire, really damaged the stones, and caused the collapse of the wooden superstructure. My predecessor did what has been done for at least 100 years on these sites, where the walls are simply too far gone in terms of their structural stability. They were taken down, reconstructed, and a great deal of new material was used. That proved to be tough. It took time, it took money, and so in the interim, a very ingenious system of sandbagging was put in place, which, like so many temporary solutions, became long-term. And that solution, perpetuated each year, became really an eyesore on the site. So we knew we had to deal with this in a way that we could sustain, but would also give us a better alternative in terms of the archaeological value. And so a quick and dirty recording system was set up. You can see the splay in the walls. These are compound veneer walls that have splayed from the fire, leading to potential collapse. And here's the recording that we've been doing, stone by stone, and then here just a series of vignettes, before in the upper left and after on the lower right. Hopefully you can't see too much difference. They are completely stabilized, largely through a corset of stainless steel wire cable that has been threaded in the center to keep them from splaying any further. So we've not had to disassemble them. We have preserved their archaeological integrity. And so here, as found in the course of preservation, and as they are today, also with a nice carpet of koa grass growing on. These have been completely stabilized. If we don't say these walls as an indication of the plan of the terrace building, the visitor has no idea what this structure looked like, at least in plan. And Gordion, for me, it's all about the plan, because that is what you see as a visitor from the top of the mountain looking in. It's all about the plan. Okay, Brian mentioned the Pebble Mosaic, truly an astonishing find. It's amazing how little was written about it when it was found. It still remains the earliest known mosaic, and one made of pebbles. And as he mentions, very enigmatic design that appears to be indiscriminate carpets laid down of different patterns of weaving. And here this gorgeous watercolor by Jonathan Last, which is here at the museum, and hopefully will be on display for the show. Here you see them exposing the final layer of debris from the floor. The floor suffered a fate many mosaics did. It was attempted to be lifted. This was a bit unusual because of the nature of the matrix for the mosaic. It was laid not in hydraulic lime like Roman mosaics. It was laid in clay. It was pebbles, and so results that had proven effective for these other antique pavements was not so effective here. The result was portions of it were removed, laid in a cement bed, and then positioned outside in the newly built museum 10 years after it was lifted. And here it is. Today you can see much of the attempt to do this cause cement to spill onto the surface through the cracks and really conceal much of the beauty of the design. Now, we've attempted to identify where all the panels that were cut out and lifted, where they belong on the original watercolor, which is the best documentation we have. You can see that on the left, so not all of the floor was lifted. We've been able to position it, and then just one detail of one panel, with all its conditions mapped out for future conservation. A few years ago, we began that process with this tripod to record the conditions, preliminary conservation work, cleaning, and then last year, setting up a proto-robotic router to remove the cementitious backing in a way that won't cause damage from percussive hammering, which is the way this is often removed on more traditional mosaics. And then the last component of this, the visitor circuit and signage, we come full circle here, because all of the work on the buildings is of course important and necessary, but we can't simply exclude the public from visiting or even partaking of the work if we don't provide for their visitation. And so you remember that early image, which was less than hospitable. We have spent a lot of time, and again, Brian's been incredibly supportive on this, to recreate a visitor path, to make that safe with a new design fencing, to install steps, and then to script that journey. He and I walked the path, and we talked about narratives. We looked inside the pit, we looked outside to the landscape, and narratives were written, and then they were, waysides were designed, and then they were installed on site. So here you see this final image, Gordion Real. Here's the entrance, one of the entrance waysides. There's the glacis he was mentioning, the gate just poking up, newly constructed steps, a language to the elements that we have added that are consistent, modern, and I think quite effective and don't intrude on the visual sense of the place. And then, of course, Gordion Virtual, we have to remember it's about information dissemination and communication. Two websites, the museum's website at the bottom, Digital Gordion, and the one that we've created on conservation at the School of Design. So I just want to end with this quote from Sam Johnson, because I think it's very pertinent for me when I think about what we actually hope to feel, to know, to see when we visit an archaeological site. Whatever withdraws us from the power of our senses, whatever makes the past, the distant, or the future predominate over the present, advances us in the dignity of human beings. So on behalf of the whole team, thank you very much for coming tonight. We'd be happy to answer any questions.